Tonight, we're going to explore 11 laws, 11 principles, 11 invisible structures that shape every moment of your life, yet you barely notice they exist. These are not the laws of physics, not the laws of nature, but something perhaps more powerful, the laws that built civilization, stone by stone, word by word, principle by principle. They govern how justice works, how power is limited, how your rights are protected. They operate in silence, in the background, creating the framework within which your entire life unfolds. And here's what makes this exploration different. We're not here to make you anxious about these systems, not here to frighten you with how much power they wield. We're here to understand them, to see them clearly, to fall asleep tonight not with fear, but with awareness, with the quiet knowledge that these invisible structures exist, and that understanding them gives you a kind of peace. Tonight, we discover 11 laws that changed everything, that built the world you live in, that protect you in ways you've never consciously considered. Let's begin. Law 1. Hammurabi's Code, the principle of proportional justice. The year is 1754 BCE, before the Common Era, before Christ, before Buddha, before the great teachers and prophets who would reshape human consciousness. In the heart of ancient Babylon, under a burning Mesopotamian sun that beat down on mud brick walls and dusty streets, a massive stone pillar stands in the city center, waiting, enduring, testifying. It is nearly 8 feet tall, made of black diorite, harder than granite, harder than iron, harder than almost anything the ancient world knew how to shape and carve. Upon its surface, carved with meticulous precision by skilled artisans working day after day under the watchful eyes of the king's overseers, are 282 laws. 282 rules for how society should function, how disputes should be resolved, how order should be maintained in the chaos of human interaction. And at the top of this pillar, at the very crown of this monument to law, a scene is carved in relief. King Hammurabi, standing tall and proud, receiving these laws from Shamash, the sun god of justice, the divine source of order in a chaotic world. But it is one phrase from this ancient code, just one phrase among hundreds, that will echo through 4,000 years of human civilization. One phrase that you have heard, that you know. Even if you have never studied ancient history, even if you have never thought deeply about where our ideas of justice come from. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Let us pause here, right here at this ancient principle, and let us truly understand what this meant, what it changed, what revolution it represented in human consciousness. Before Hammurabi, before this code, before these words were carved into black stone, justice was arbitrary, capricious, terrifying in its unpredictability. If a powerful man's son was injured by someone of a lower station, that powerful man might demand the death of the entire family who wronged him, might demand their property, their children, their very existence erased from the earth. If a nobleman's property was damaged, he might seize everything the perpetrator owned, everything his family possessed, leaving children to starve in the streets, leaving wives to beg or worse. Justice was not blind in those days. It was not balanced. It was not measured. It was capricious, vengeful, and impossibly cruel, weighted always toward those with power, with wealth, with the ability to enforce their will through violence or the threat of violence. Hammurabi's Code changed something fundamental, something deep in human psychology, something that seems so obvious to us now that we forget it had to be invented, had to be discovered, had to be carved into stone and enforced by the power of the state. It introduced a concept, a revolutionary concept, the concept of proportionality. The punishment must fit the crime, must match the harm, must balance the scales. No more and no less. Imagine now. Imagine for a moment that you are a farmer in ancient Babylon. Your hands are rough from working the fields, from guiding the plough, from harvesting barley under that merciless sun. You have a small plot of land, just enough to feed your family, just enough to pay your taxes to the king and the temple, just enough to survive. Your neighbor's ox, a great lumbering beast, breaks through a fence and tramples your field, destroys your crops, ruins months of work in a single afternoon of chaos and destruction. There was once a merchant named Nidnatum who traveled the dusty roads between Babylon and Ur, carrying his goods on donkeys, sleeping in caravanserais, making his living through trade in copper and tin, the metals that, when alloyed together, created the bronze that gave this age its name. He was a careful man, meticulous in his accounts, honest in his dealings, known among the traders as someone whose word could be trusted, whose scales were true, whose promises were kept. One day, while staying at a caravanserai, a wayside inn for travellers on the long road between the great cities, his purse was stolen in the night, and in that purse was not just his own silver, his own hard-earned profit from months of trading, but silver entrusted to him by other merchants, by his partners, by men who had faith in his honesty and relied on his safe delivery of their wealth. The innkeeper, a woman named Amat Mamu who had inherited the caravanserai from her father and worked hard to maintain it, to keep it safe, to protect the travellers who sought shelter there. She was brought before the judges, brought to account for the theft that had occurred under her roof, under the old ways, the ancient ways before Hammurabi's Code brought order to chaos. She might have been enslaved. Her family might have been seized to pay for all the silver that was lost, every coin, every shekel, regardless of whether she herself had stolen it, regardless of whether she had any control over the thief who had crept through her halls in the darkness. She would have been held responsible, absolutely responsible, for everything that happened under her roof, and her entire life, her children's lives, would have been destroyed to make the merchants whole again. But under Hammurabi's Code, under this new system of proportional justice, the law was specific, was measured, was bounded by reason rather than rage. The innkeeper must restore the stolen property, must make the merchants whole. If the thief could not be found, couldn't be made to return what he had taken, then yes, the innkeeper must pay the value of what was lost. But no more than that. Just the value. Just the restitution. Her family would not be enslaved. Her entire life would not be destroyed. Her children would not be torn from her arms and sold in the marketplace for one crime committed by another person, by a thief she never knew, never hired, never aided. Amat Mamu worked for years to repay the debt. She added rooms to her inn, worked through long nights, saved every copper piece, denied herself comforts, postponed repairs to her own dwelling. But she kept her freedom, kept her dignity, kept her children safe and free. And when the debt was finally paid, when the last silver piece was counted out before the judges, she could hold her head high in the marketplace. She had been wronged by a thief, had been required to pay for another's crime, but justice had been served without destroying her. The punishment had fit the scope of her responsibility, had been proportional to her actual fault, and no more. This story, in variations and echoes, played out thousands of times across Mesopotamia, across the dusty cities and fertile fields watered by the Tigris and Euphrates. And each time it played out, each time the code was applied, each time punishment was measured and limited and proportional, it reinforced a new way of thinking about justice, a new way of understanding the relationship between wrong and consequence. Humans began to internalize the idea, began to feel in their bones that retaliation should be measured, that vengeance should have limits, that society functions better, more smoothly, more peacefully, when punishment is proportional to harm, when the scales are balanced rather than tipped always toward excess and terror. Today, 4,000 years later, sitting or lying where you are right now in this moment, this principle lives in every legal system on earth. When a judge determines a sentence in a courtroom, when a civil court calculates damages in a lawsuit, when international law prohibits collective punishment of civilian populations, when we feel instinctively that a punishment is too harsh or too lenient, we are living under the shadow of that black diorite pillar in ancient Babylon. We are thinking thoughts that Hammurabi's scribes carved into stone. We are using mental frameworks that were revolutionary 4 millennia ago. The psychological legacy is deep, deeper than most of us realize. Proportional justice taught humanity restraint, taught us to control the rage that rises when we are wronged, taught us to measure our response rather than unleashing everything we feel. It created the mental framework for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for moving past injury without endless cycles of revenge that consume generations. It changed us, changed our species, from creatures of unlimited vengeance into beings capable of measured justice, capable of saying this far and no farther, capable of ending conflicts rather than perpetuating them forever. In your own life, in your own experience of the world, this principle shapes more than you realize. When you think that punishment was too harsh for what they did, when you feel that someone got what they deserved, when you argue that the penalty should fit the crime, you are using the mental architecture that Hammurabi built. You are thinking thoughts made possible by a Babylonian king's decision to carve rules into stone rather than leaving justice to the unpredictable whims of power and rage. So as you drift toward a sleep tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind settles into rest, consider this: the voice in your head that calls for fairness, that demands balanced consequences, that insists on measured justice rather than unlimited retaliation. That voice was shaped by a king you never met, in a language you never spoke, in a city long buried under sand and time, carved into stone harder than your bones, lasting far longer than any throne or crown or empire. Rest now. Let this truth settle into your understanding like sediment drift into the bottom of a still pool. Justice is not vengeance. Justice is measured, balanced, proportional. This simple truth, learned over millennia, paid for in suffering and blood and the slow, difficult work of building civilization from chaos, This truth is part of who you are, is woven into how you think, is one of the invisible foundations that makes your world possible. Sleep peacefully. The principle of proportional justice stands watch over you, carved in stone, written in law, embedded in consciousness, making civilization possible, making peace imaginable, making tomorrow safer than yesterday. One balanced judgment, one measured consequence, one proportional punishment at a time. Law 2, the 12 tables, written law for all. Let us move forward now through the corridors of time, forward through the centuries, from the dust and heat of Mesopotamia to the 7 hills of Rome, to the city that would give its name to an empire, to a civilization that would reshape the Western world in ways that still echo through every courtroom, every legislature, every legal code from London to Los Angeles. The year is 451 BCE, before the Common Era. The Roman Republic is young, vibrant, pulsing with energy and ambition, but deeply, profoundly troubled by conflict between 2 classes of citizens who viewed each other with suspicion and resentment across an unbridgeable social gulf. The patricians, the aristocratic class, the old families who trace their lineage back to the founding of Rome itself. They held all power, all authority, all control over the machinery of state and law. And the plebeians, the common people, the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who made up the bulk of Rome's population. They had neither power nor voice nor any real protection against the arbitrary decisions of their social betters. The patricians held all the cards, knew all the rules, controlled all the outcomes, because the laws existed only in their memories, in their traditions, in their oral pronouncements passed down from father to son in the great houses on the Palatine Hill. A patrician judge could declare what the law said, could interpret ancient custom however he pleased, and the plebeians had no way to challenge him, no way to verify, no way to say, "Show me where it is written," because nothing was written. Nothing was public. Nothing could be checked or verified or appealed to by those outside the circle of power. Justice was whatever the powerful said it was on any given day, on any given case. For any given person who came before them seeking resolution of disputes or protection of rights they weren't even sure they possessed. The plebeians were not fools. They recognized tyranny even when it wore the respectable mask of tradition and custom. They understood that invisible law was simply another name for arbitrary power. And so they did something remarkable, something that would change not just Rome but the entire future of Western civilization. They threatened to leave, all of them, every plebeian, every common person. They would abandon Rome, would march out beyond the walls, would found their own city and let the patricians rule over empty streets and silent forums. Let them govern themselves and see how long their power lasted without the laborers and soldiers and craftsmen who actually made Rome function. This threat, this act of collective resistance known to history as the secession of the plebs, forced a compromise that the patricians could not avoid, couldn't ignore, couldn't simply dismiss with aristocratic disdain. A commission was formed. 10 men, the decemviri, the 10 tasked with a revolutionary mission that would have been unthinkable just years before. Write down the laws, make them public, carve them into bronze tablets and display them in the forum where every citizen, patrician and plebeian alike could see them, could read them, could know with certainty what the rules actually were. The result was the 12 tables. 12 bronze tablets containing the fundamental laws of Rome, the basic rules by which Roman society would operate, the foundation of what would become one of the most influential legal systems in human history. Some of the laws seem strange to modern ears, alien to our sensibilities. If a person has sung or composed a song that insults another, he shall be clubbed to death. Harsh, brutal. A reminder that these were ancient people with ancient values. Others are surprisingly progressive, surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of social dynamics. Women shall remain in guardianship even when they have attained their majority, reflecting the patriarchal nature of Roman society, but at least establishing clear rules about it. But it is not the content of these specific laws that matters most in our story tonight. Not the particular rules about property or inheritance or insults. It is the act of writing them down, the revolutionary decision to make law public, visible, knowable by anyone who wished to understand the rules by which they were governed. This changed human consciousness in a profound way, in a way that ripples down through 25 centuries to reach you right now, right here, as you listen to these words and drift towards sleep. It democratized justice, made it accessible, transformed it from the private possession of the powerful into a public resource that anyone could consult, anyone could cite, anyone could use to defend their rights. For the first time in Roman history, for the first time in this civilization that would eventually rule the Mediterranean world from Britain to Egypt, a plebeian could stand before a patrician judge and say with confidence, with certainty, with the weight of written law behind him, "No, the law says otherwise. Here it is, written in bronze for all to see. You cannot change it to suit your preference, cannot reinterpret it to favor your friends, cannot claim that ancient tradition says something different when the written words prove you wrong." The psychological impact rippled through Roman society like waves spreading across a pond, and eventually over centuries, through all of Western civilization. Written law created a shared reality, a common ground, a place where rich and poor, powerful and weak, patrician and plebeian, were all looking at the same rules, reading the same words, bound by the same publicly declared principles. This created something remarkable, something that would have been impossible under the old system of invisible law passed down through aristocratic memory. It created the possibility of genuine fairness, not because rulers became kinder or more virtuous, not because the powerful suddenly cared more about the weak, but because the rules were visible, checkable, enforceable through appeal to publicly declare standards that everyone could see. Let us imagine a story from ancient Rome, a tale that captures this transformation, this shift from invisible to visible law, from arbitrary power to accountable justice. There was a young plebeian named Marcus Horatius. His father had died in battle fighting for Rome against the Etruscan cities to the north, had fallen with the spear through his chest, defending the bridge over the Tiber, had been honored as a hero but left his family with little, beyond a small farm and the pride of his sacrifice. Marcus was barely past boyhood when he became the head of his family, responsible for his mother, for his two sisters, for keeping the farm productive enough to feed them and pay the taxes that Rome demanded. It was not much. This little farm on the outskirts of the city, just a few jugera of land, some olive trees, some grain fields, a small vineyard. But it fed his family, kept them housed and clothed, gave them a place in Roman society, gave them dignity and independence. A patrician senator named Appius Claudius desired Marcus's land. His own estate bordered the little farm, and Appius had plans for expansion, plans for consolidating properties, plans that required removing this young plebeian and his family from land they had worked for generations. Under the old ways, before the 12 tables, before law was written and public, Appius would have simply declared some ancient legal principle, would have claimed some obscure debt that Marcus's father had supposedly owed, would have invented some customary law about patrician rights to expand their holdings, and Marcus would have had no recourse, no appeal, no way to challenge the claims because there was nothing written to point to, nothing public to cite. Just the word of a powerful senator against the word of a plebeian boy barely old enough to shave. But now, in this new Rome, after the secession, after the compromise, the 12 tables stood in the forum, bronze tablets gleaming in the Roman sun, publicly displayed where anyone who could read, and literacy was spreading among the plebeians. Now that there was actually something worth reading, could see exactly what the law said. And Marcus, though young and poor, could read. His father had insisted on teaching him, had believed with the fervour of a soldier who had seen the world changing, that in this new Rome, in this Rome of written law, knowledge would be power, literacy would be armour, understanding the rules would be a shield against aristocratic predation. When Appius brought his case before the judge, claiming with aristocratic confidence that some old debt entitled him to seize Marcus's land, Marcus did something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, something that made the patricians in the forum shift uncomfortably and whisper among themselves. He pointed to table 6, raised his arm and indicated the bronze tablet that hung there for all to see, and he read aloud in a clear voice that carried across the forum. When one party makes a claim, the burden of proof rests upon the claimant. Simple words, a simple principle, but revolutionary in their implications. The burden of proof. The responsibility to demonstrate the truth of your claim rested on Appius, not on Marcus. Appius had no proof. No documents existed because Marcus's father had owed him nothing. No witnesses could be produced because the debt was invented. Just his assertion, his aristocratic confidence, his expectation that his word would be enough simply because of who he was, because of his name, because of the power his family had wielded in Rome since the city's founding. But the judge, aware that the 12 tables were public, that crowds had gathered to watch these proceedings, that his interpretation of written law could now be challenged by anyone who could read those bronze tablets, ruled in Marcus's favour. The law was clear. The burden of proof lay with the claimant. Appius had not met that burden. Marcus kept his farm, but more than that, something more profound than just one case, one ruling, one young man keeping his family's land. Something shifted in Marcus's understanding of the world, in his psychology, in how he thought about himself and his place in Roman society. He was not helpless, not powerless, not simply at the mercy of aristocratic whims and patrician ambitions. The law was not an invisible force controlled by the powerful for their own benefit. It was written, knowable, a tool he could learn to use, a weapon he could wield even against senators and their ancient families. This story, repeated across Rome in thousands of variations, in countless cases large and small, created a new type of citizen, a new type of person. Romans began to view themselves not just as subjects of power, but as people of law, as members of a civilization built not just on military might and territorial conquest, but on codified principles that applied, at least in theory, to everyone. This became part of Roman identity, woven into the culture so deeply that even as the Republic fell and emperors ruled with absolute power, even as democracy gave way to autocracy, the tradition of written law persisted, continued, remained a foundation of Roman civilization that would outlast any individual ruler or dynasty. The 12 tables influenced everything that came after. When Roman law spread across Europe with the empire's expansion, carried by legions and administrators and jurists to Gaul and Hispania and Britannia and Germania, it carried this principle, this fundamental insight that law must be written, must be public, must be knowable by those who are governed by it. This influenced the development of every Western legal system, every code, every statute, every constitution that would be written in the centuries and millennia to come. The concept of rule of law, the idea that even rulers are bound by written statutes that can be publicly consulted and enforced, traces directly back to those bronze tablets in the Roman Forum. In the modern world, in your world, in the world you inhabit right now, as you listen to these words and feel sleep approaching, you live under this legacy every single day. When you look up a statute in a law library or on a government website, when you reference a regulation in an argument with bureaucracy, when you demand that authorities follow their own written rules, when you say, "Show me where it says that," to someone claiming power over you, you're exercising a right that would not exist without the 12 tables. The assumption that you can know what the law says, that it is not hidden in the minds of the powerful, that it is not secret knowledge passed down through elite families, that it is public and accessible and verifiable. This assumption is relatively new in human history. It is not natural, not inevitable, not something that humans have always expected or even imagined possible. The psychological shift was enormous, deeper than we can easily grasp from our position on this side of history. Written law created accountability. It meant rulers could be hypocrites. Yes, could violate their own stated principles, but at least their hypocrisy could be exposed. At least the gap between what the law said and what authorities actually did became visible, and that visibility created pressure for justice, created embarrassment for those who violated publicly declared principles, created grounds for resistance and reform. Think about your own life now, about your own interactions with power and authority. When you feel frustrated by bureaucracy, when you demand to see the written rule, when you say, "Show me where it says that," to someone claiming authority over you, when you insist on transparency from those in power, you are channeling a revolutionary insight from ancient Rome. An insight carved into bronze tablets 2,500 years ago. Justice requires that the rules be written where all can see them. This seems obvious to you now, seems like common sense, like the natural order of things, but it was fought for, struggled for, won through the threat of mass exodus by people who refused to live under invisible law any longer. As you drift deeper into rest now, deeper into that space between waking and sleeping, let this thought settle into your consciousness like sediment drifting through still water. The words you can read, the laws you can look up, the regulations you can cite when defending your rights. These are not natural features of human society. They were created, established, maintained across generations through constant vigilance and occasional struggle. You live in a world where law is visible, where power must justify itself by reference to publicly declared principles, where the rules are not secret. This is not a small thing, not a trivial achievement, not something to take for granted as you close your eyes and drift toward dreams. Sleep now, knowing that the foundation of transparent justice was laid 2,500 years ago on bronze tablets that no longer exist, that have long since been melted down or lost or destroyed, but whose principles live in every statute book on earth, in every constitution, in every law library, in every moment when someone says the law says, and points to words that anyone can read. Rest peacefully. The law is written. The rules are public. And that visibility, that transparency, that accountability is one of the great achievements of human civilization, quietly holding back the darkness of arbitrary power, one written word at a time. Law 3. Magna Carta, the king, under law. Move with me now, forward through the centuries once again. We leave Rome as it crumbles under barbarian invasions and internal decay. We pass through the chaos of the Dark Ages when written law seemed to fade from Europe and local strongmen ruled by force alone. And we arrive in England, in the year 1215, in a soggy meadow called Runnymede beside the River Thames. King John of England, perhaps the most despised monarch in all of English history, universally hated by his subjects, mocked by his contemporaries, remembered by history as weak and treacherous and cruel, stands in this meadow facing an army of his own barons who have finally had enough of his tyranny. John is a tyrant in every sense that matters. He has raised taxes to punishing levels, to crushing burdens on his nobles and commons alike, to fund his foreign wars, his failed attempts to reconquer the French territories his father and brother had once held. He has seized lands arbitrarily, has confiscated property without cause or justification, has helped himself to the wealth of his subjects whenever his treasury ran low. He has imprisoned nobles without trial, has held them in dark cells until their families paid enormous ransoms for their release, has ignored every custom, every tradition, every expectation of how a king should behave toward those who owed him allegiance. And now, on this June day in 1215, his barons have had enough. They arrive at Runnymede with an army at their backs. They present John with a document, a list of demands, a charter that will come to be known simply as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It contains 63 clauses. Most of them deal with specific grievances against John's rule, specific limitations on royal power, specific protections for noble rights and properties. They are medieval, feudal, concerned with knights' fees and inheritance laws and forest rights, details that seem arcane and irrelevant to modern ears. But buried within these clauses, hidden among the technical details of feudal law, are principles that will reshape human civilization, principles that will echo through 8 centuries, principles that will inspire revolutions and constitutions and declarations of human rights, principles that will fundamentally change how humans think about power and authority and the relationship between rulers and ruled. Clause 39 is the most important, the most revolutionary, the seed from which forests of law will grow. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Read that again, slowly. Let each word sink in. Let the revolutionary nature of these words wash over you as you drift toward a sleep. The king cannot simply imprison someone, cannot simply seize property, cannot simply destroy a person's life and standing. He must follow law. He's bound by it, constrained by it, subject to it. Just as his subjects are. This is revolutionary. This changes everything. For millennia. For as long as humans had organized themselves into kingdoms and empires, kings had been considered above law. They were law incarnate. Their word was law. They were accountable only to God, only to the divine authority that supposedly granted them their crowns and thrones. They could do as they pleased to their subjects because their will was the only law that mattered. But Magna Carta established something different, something unprecedented, something that would prove impossible to fully suppress, even as kings tried desperately to stuff this genie back into its bottle. The king is under the law, not above it. He is bound by principles that transcend his personal will, by rules that exist independently of his desires, by obligations he cannot simply ignore when they become inconvenient. John signed the charter with no intention of honoring it. His signature, his seal pressed into the wax, meant nothing to him. He immediately asked the Pope to annul it, and the Pope, happy to support royal prerogatives against rebellious subjects, declared Magna Carta void, said it had been extracted under duress and therefore had no legal force. Civil war erupted. England descended into chaos. John died within a year, possibly poisoned, possibly from dysentery, possibly from the stress and rage of his impossible situation. And yet, despite all this, despite John's bad faith and the Pope's annulment and the Civil War, Magna Carta survived. It was reissued by John's son, revised and confirmed. It was reissued again by successive kings, each time under pressure from barons who remembered what had been promised at Runnymede, each time becoming more firmly embedded in English constitutional tradition. It became not just a document, but a symbol, not just a charter, but a principle, not just words on parchment, but a foundational concept that would not die. And its psychological impact spread far beyond England's shores, far beyond the immediate conflict between King John and his rebellious barons, far beyond the medieval feudal context in which it was written. Let us consider a story, not from 1215, not from the meadow at Runnymede, but from centuries later, when Magna Carta's principles had seeped into the consciousness of English-speaking peoples, had become part of how they thought about power and rights and the proper relationship between government and governed. In colonial Massachusetts, in the year 1761, more than 500 years after Magna Carta, a lawyer named James Otis stood before the Superior Court in Boston. The British Crown had issued rights of assistance, general warrants allowing customs officials to search any home or business for smuggled goods, without specifying what they were looking for, without explaining why they suspected a particular location, without any particular cause beyond the general authority of the Crown. Otis argued passionately that these writs violated fundamental rights, rights that trace back through centuries of English legal tradition, back through the common law, back through the Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights, back ultimately to Magna Carta itself. A man's home was his castle. An Englishman's dwelling was sacred. The government could not invade it without specific cause, without following proper procedure, without being accountable to law rather than simply wielding arbitrary power. The government, Otis argued with growing passion and eloquence, must be bound by law. It cannot simply do as it pleases. It must justify its actions, must follow established procedures, must respect rights that existed before any particular government came to power, rights that in Otis's view were fundamental to the English Constitution, to what it meant to be English, to the inheritance of liberty that stretched back to Runnymede and beyond. Otis lost the case. The court ruled against him. The writs of assistance were upheld as valid exercises of royal authority. But a young lawyer named John Adams sat in that courtroom that day, sat and listened, sat and absorbed every word of Otis's argument, and he later wrote that in those hours, in that courtroom in colonial Boston, the child independence was born. The argument that government must be bound by law, that even royal authority has limits, that there are rights which no power can violate without becoming tyrannical. This argument planted seeds that would grow into revolution within 15 years. The psychological shift that Magna Carta represented is difficult to overstate from our position 8 centuries later. For thousands of years, humans had conceived of authority as flowing downward from rulers. The king commanded, the people obeyed. Power was hierarchical, absolute, divinely ordained. To question it was not just illegal, but blasphemous. Not just rebellion, but sin. Magna Carta introduced a different concept into human consciousness, a revolutionary idea that would prove impossible to completely suppress, the concept of reciprocal obligation. The king had duties to his subjects, real duties, enforceable duties. If he violated those duties, if he broke his side of the bargain, if he acted as a tyrant rather than as a just ruler, then resistance was not rebellion, but justice. Opposition was not treason, but the defense of rights. Authority was conditional, not absolute. It rested on a foundation of mutual obligation. The king ruled by law, not simply by power, and if he violated law, if he broke the compact between ruler and ruled, then his subjects had not just the right, but the duty to resist, to demand justice, to insist on the fulfillment of obligations that bound both sides. This changed how people thought about themselves in relation to power, profoundly and permanently. They were not merely subjects, not passive recipients of commands from above. They were parties to a social contract, to an agreement, to a relationship that imposed obligations on both ruler and ruled. They had rights that preceded and transcended any individual ruler's will. rights that existed independently of royal favour, rights that could be claimed and defended and fought for. In the centuries following Magna Carta, as this principle slowly, gradually, unevenly spread through Western consciousness, it influenced everything that came after. It shaped the English Bill of Rights in 1689, the document that finally limited royal power in ways that stuck, that created parliamentary supremacy, that established principles of government under law rather than government by royal whim. It shaped the American Constitution. The framers explicitly cited Magna Carta as a source, as an inspiration, as proof that limits on government power were part of the English inheritance they claimed. They built on Magna Carta's principles, expanded them, applied them to republican government rather than monarchy, but the core insight remained the same. Government must be bound by law. Power must be accountable. Rights exist that no authority can justly violate. It echoed through the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, through the constitutions written in Latin America when colonies threw off Spanish rule, through the movements for representative government and constitutional monarchy that swept Europe in the 19th century. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations after World War II, carries Magna Carta's DNA, its fundamental insight that power must be limited, that rulers must be accountable, that there are rights that transcend the will of any government. Today, right now, in this moment, as you listen to these words and feel sleep approaching, you live in a world shaped by this medieval document signed in a muddy field beside the Thames. When you say that's unconstitutional, when you assert your rights against government overreach, when you demand that leaders follow their own rules, when you insist that no one is above the law, you are invoking Magna Carta's legacy. The psychological impact on modern humans is profound, deeper than most of us consciously realize. We have internalized the belief that no one is above the law. This belief shapes how we view scandals, how we react to corruption, how we judge abuses of power. When leaders break rules, when the powerful ignore laws that bind the rest of us, we feel genuine outrage. Not because we are surprised that powerful people do wrong things, but because we have absorbed the principle that they are supposed to be bound by the same laws as everyone else. This expectation, this mental framework, this assumption about how power should operate, did not exist for most of human history. Kings were expected to be ruthless, to do whatever was necessary to maintain power, to place themselves above the rules that govern common people, that they should be constrained by law, that they should be accountable to principles rather than simply wielding power, would have seemed absurd to most ancient peoples, would have seemed like madness, like weakness, like a fundamental misunderstanding of what kingship meant. But you live after Magna Carta. You were born into a world where its principles are so embedded in law and custom and expectation that they seem natural, inevitable, obvious. And so you carry within your mind a revolutionary idea, an idea that would have seemed impossible in ancient Egypt or Assyria or even in Rome under the Caesars. Power must be accountable. Authority must be limited. No one, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how high their office, is above the law. As you sink deeper into sleep now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts drift, Let this understanding wash over you like water flowing over smooth stones. The rights you take for granted, the expectations you have of how authority should behave, these are not natural or inevitable, or built into the structure of human societies. They were fought for, bled for, died for, written into a document 800 years ago by desperate nobles facing a tyrant king in a wet meadow beside a river in England. Rest now, peacefully, deeply. The principle that even kings must follow law is woven into the fabric of your civilization. Invisible but unbreakable, flexible but strong. Holding back tyranny like a dam holds back flood waters. Protecting you even as you dream, even as you sleep, even as you let go of consciousness and drift into the darkness where law and power and rights and obligations all dissolve into the formless realm of rest, sleep. The king is under law, and that simple principle, that revolutionary idea, that transformation of human consciousness, changes everything, protects everything, makes civilization possible, makes freedom imaginable, makes justice something more than the arbitrary will of whoever holds power in any given moment. Good night. Rest well. The law stands watch while you sleep. Law 4. Habeas Corpus. The body must be present. We remain in England now, but move forward through time. Forward to the year 1679. The chaos of civil war is behind us. The execution of one king and the restoration of another are matters of living memory. Parliament passes the Habeas Corpus Act, codifying a principle that had existed in English common law for centuries, but had been frequently ignored, frequently violated, frequently set aside by monarchs who found it inconvenient when dealing with enemies and dissidents. Habeas corpus. Latin words that will become sacred to the cause of human freedom. You shall have the body. A strange phrase for one of humanity's most important protections against tyranny. The principle is simple, elegant in its clarity, powerful in its implications. If the government imprisons someone, if the state takes away a person's freedom, if authority locks a human being in a cell, then it must bring that person before a judge and show legal cause for the detention. The prisoner must be produced, physically, bodily, literally present in court, and the government must justify, must explain, must prove that it has legal grounds for holding this person. Secret imprisonment is illegal. Indefinite detention without charge is illegal. Making people disappear into the machinery of state power is illegal. The person's body must be present before a court, and the government must justify why they are holding it. Before habeas corpus became firmly established, before it was written into law and protected by parliamentary authority, a person could simply disappear. A king could have enemies seized in the night, thrown into dungeons in the Tower of London or remote castles, held for years or decades or forever. No trial, no charges, no one even officially confirming they were imprisoned. Families would search endlessly for loved ones who had simply vanished into the silent machinery of royal power, who existed in a limbo between freedom and death, neither tried nor released, neither guilty nor innocent, simply gone. Habeas corpus changed this fundamental reality. It gave imprisonment a deadline, a requirement, an accountability structure that could not easily be evaded. Detain someone if you must, if you truly believe they pose a danger, if you truly have grounds for arrest, But you must quickly bring them before a court and explain yourself. You must produce the body, must show the person, must justify to an independent judge why this detention is legal and necessary. No more disappearances. No more secret cells where people rotted for years without anyone knowing they were there. No more families endlessly searching for loved ones who had been erased from existence by the stroke of a royal pen. The psychological impact of habeas corpus on both the detained and on society as a whole is profound, difficult to fully appreciate from our position centuries later in societies where this protection is so embedded in law that we forget it had to be fought for. For the prisoner, habeas corpus means hope has a timeline. Even in the darkness of a cell, even facing the terror of state power, even uncertain about your fate, you know that the law requires your body to be brought into the light, before a judge, before witnesses, where your case must be heard, where the government must justify your detention or release you. This is not a small comfort when you are imprisoned, when you are cut off from family and friends, when you are vulnerable to abuse and neglect, when you exist at the mercy of jailers and guards. The knowledge that there is a legal mechanism, a required procedure, a deadline by which you must be brought before a court. This knowledge can be the difference between despair and endurance. For society, habeas corpus creates accountability around imprisonment. It forces the state to acknowledge its prisoners, to process them through visible procedures, to bring them into public view where their treatment can be observed, where their cases can be examined, where the justification for their detention can be challenged. This visibility constrains power in ways both subtle and significant. It is harder to torture someone if you must produce their unmarked body in court within days. Harder to extract false confessions through brutal means if the evidence of that brutality will be visible to judges and lawyers. Harder to hold someone indefinitely on flimsy grounds if you must regularly justify the detention before skeptical magistrates. Let us visit a story that illustrates the power of habeas corpus. Not from England where it originated, but from America where the principle travelled across the ocean and took root in new soil. In 1807, in the state of Virginia, a free black man named Solomon was traveling to visit family in another county. He carried papers proving his free status, documents that were absolutely essential for any free black person traveling in slave states, papers without which he could be seized, could be assumed to be an escaped slave, could be sold into bondage. But on a country road, far from towns or witnesses, he was seized by slave catchers, professional bounty hunters who made their living by capturing escaped slaves and returning them to their masters for rewards. His papers were destroyed, burned or torn up, eliminated as evidence that he was free rather than enslaved. He was bound, gagged, transported south, and sold to a plantation owner in the Deep South for 12 years, for more than a decade. Solomon lived as a slave, his free status erased, his identity stolen. His life before this moment simply dilated as if it had never existed. His family searched desperately, made inquiries, tried every avenue they could think of, but he had vanished into the vast system of Southern slavery, one man among millions, impossible to trace, impossible to find in the enormous haystack of human bondage that stretched across the cotton states. But Solomon had a knowledge. He had lived as a free man in New York, had been educated, had learned about law and rights and protections. He knew about habeas corpus. He understood that in the North, in free states, this principle was sacred, that a person couldn't be held without being brought before a court, that detention required justification, that the body must be produced and the cause shown. And so Solomon began a careful, patient, desperately dangerous campaign. He managed to get a message to friends in New York, using trusted conductors, using coded language, risking enormous punishment if discovered. The message traveled north, slowly, through hidden networks, through channels built for moving enslaved people toward freedom. Now used to send information in the opposite direction, his friends petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus. They argued that Solomon was a free man illegally detained, that he must be brought before a court to establish the facts, that his body must be produced and the legal grounds for his enslavement demonstrated. The case became complex, tangled in the ugly contradictions of antebellum America. How do you apply habeas corpus across state lines when one state recognizes slavery and another does not? How do you bring someone before a northern court when they are held in the South? How do you establish someone's status as free or enslaved when all their documentation has been destroyed? But the principle held. If Solomon was a free man illegally detained, if his imprisonment was unlawful, then he had the right to have his case heard, his body produced, his status determined by law rather than by the mere assertion of those who held him. Eventually, after years of legal maneuvering, after countless petitions and appeals, after the grinding work of lawyers who believed in his case, Solomon was produced in court. His identity was verified through testimony of those who had known him in New York. His free status was proven through records that still existed despite the destruction of his personal papers. He was released, freed from illegal bondage, returned to his family. 12 years were gone, stolen, irretrievable. But he had his freedom, his identity, his life back. And he lived to write his story, to testify to what had happened, to become Solomon Northup, author of 12 Years a Slave, a witness to both the horrors of slavery and the power of legal principles like habeas corpus, to rescue even one person from injustice. This story illustrates habeas corpus's power even in a deeply unjust system. Slavery was legal in the South, was protected by law and enforced by violence. Habeas corpus alone could not end that evil, could not dismantle the system that treated human beings as property. But for one individual, for Solomon, the principle that government must justify detention, must produce a body before a court, must show legal cause, made the difference between lifelong enslavement and eventual freedom. The psychological legacy of habeas corpus in modern society is immense, pervasive, so deeply embedded that we barely notice it until it is threatened. You assume, likely without thinking about it consciously, that if you are arrested, you will be brought before a judge relatively quickly. You assume that detention requires charges, that imprisonment requires trial, that the government cannot simply make you disappear. These assumptions shape how you think about justice, about what is acceptable government behavior, about the basic relationship between individual freedom and state power. When habeas corpus is suspended, as it has been in wartime or emergency situations throughout history. People feel visceral unease, even when they understand the reasons given, even when they accept that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. The idea of indefinite detention without trial violates something deep in modern consciousness, something that habeas corpus created and nurtured over centuries. We have internalized the principle that the body must be brought before the court, that imprisonment requires justification, that people cannot simply disappear into the machinery of state power. This internalization is a psychological achievement of enormous significance. This was not always true. For most of human history, disappearance was a common tool of state power. Enemies of the ruler would vanish. Dissidents would be quietly eliminated. Families would mourn people who had been erased from existence. There was no recourse, no appeal, no mechanism for demanding that the disappeared be produced and accounted for. Habeas corpus makes this harder, not impossible. Tyrants and dictatorships still find ways, still create black sites and secret prisons, still make people disappear when they believe they can get away with it. But habeas corpus makes it harder, makes it more visible, makes it a violation that can be pointed to and condemned. It creates a legal expectation, a procedure that must be followed or obviously violated. And that visibility, that requirement to justify imprisonment in public, that necessity of producing the body before a court, constrains power in ways both subtle and significant. In your own life, in the world you inhabit right now as you drift towards sleep, habeas corpus protects you more than you likely realize. Every time police must process someone through the criminal justice system, must bring them before a judge within a specified time, must show cause for continued detention, habeas corpus is operating. The principle is so embedded in modern legal systems that we forget it had to be fought for, established, defended across centuries. As you drift toward deeper sleep now, as your body relaxes and your mind lets go of the day's concerns, consider this, the knowledge that you cannot simply disappear, that imprisonment requires visibility, that detention must be justified before a court. This knowledge creates a sense of security so fundamental that you probably do not even consciously think about it. But humans lived for millennia without this protection, lived in fear of the knock on the door in the night, lived knowing that arrest could mean disappearance, that detention could mean years in forgotten cells with no one even knowing you were there. You have this protection because centuries ago, people fought for the principle that the body must be brought before the law, that detention must be justified, that imprisonment must be accountable, that people cannot be made to simply vanish into the apparatus of state power. Rest peacefully now, deeply. The chains of arbitrary detention have been, if not broken, at least made visible. And visibility is the first step toward justice, toward accountability, toward a world where power must explain itself, must produce the body, must justify its actions before independent judges who serve law rather than merely executing the will of those in power. Sleep. The body must be present. This simple requirement, this basic procedural protection, stands between you and the darkness of disappearance, between you and the terror of indefinite detention, between you and the void into which so many humans fell throughout history before habeas corpus made that fall illegal, visible, challengeable. Good night. Rest well. Your body is protected by law, by ancient principle, by the wisdom of those who understood that freedom requires that detention be justified, that imprisonment be visible, that the disappeared be brought into the light. Law 5, the Napoleonic Code, innocent until proven guilty. Cross the English Channel with me now. Leave behind the island nation that gave the world Habeas Corpus and Magna Carta, and arrive in France in the year 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte, not yet emperor but soon to be crowned, oversees the creation of a new legal code that will reshape not just France but eventually much of the world, the Code Civil des Français, later known as the Code Napoleon. The Napoleonic Code is a comprehensive reform of French law. It covers property rights, inheritance rules, contracts and obligations, the entire framework of civil life. But embedded within this massive codification, woven through its articles and provisions, is a principle that will revolutionize criminal justice across the globe, a principle so fundamental to modern legal consciousness that we can barely imagine justice without it, the presumption of innocence. Article 9 establishes clearly and without ambiguity that anyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof rests entirely on the prosecution, entirely on the state, entirely on those who accuse. The accused does not have to prove their innocence, does not have to demonstrate they are not guilty, does not have to establish an alibi or provide evidence of their good character. The state must prove guilt, must build a case, must convince judges or jurors beyond reasonable doubt. This seems obvious to you now, likely so obvious that you wonder why it even needs to be stated. But it was revolutionary in 1804, and for much of human history before that moment, it would have seemed strange, even dangerous, to assume that accused persons were innocent. For centuries, in many legal systems across Europe and beyond, the default assumption was suspicion, was guilt. If you were accused, especially by someone powerful or respected, you were assumed to be guilty unless you could prove otherwise. The burden was on you to establish innocence, often an impossible task when you lacked resources, lacked education, lacked the tools and knowledge necessary to defend yourself against formal charges. The psychological weight of this difference is crushing, almost unbearable when you truly consider it. Imagine being accused of a crime you did not commit under a system that assumes guilt. You are imprisoned, locked in a cell, cut off from family and friends and the resources you might use to defend yourself. And from that position of confinement and isolation, you must somehow prove you are innocent. Prove you did not do something. Prove a negative, which philosophers and logicians will tell you is often logically impossible. How do you prove you were somewhere else when you have no witnesses? How do you prove you did not take something when you cannot account for every moment of your day? How do you prove you did not harm someone when circumstances seem to point to you? Proving a negative, establishing that something did not happen, is devilishly difficult under the best circumstances, and nearly impossible when you are imprisoned and presumed guilty from the start. Now imagine the reverse, the transformation that the presumption of innocence creates. You are accused. Yes, but the law assumes your innocence from the moment of accusation. The prosecution must build a case against you, must present evidence, must convince a judge or jury beyond reasonable doubt that you committed the crime, you can remain silent, can refuse to testify, can simply wait and watch as the state tries to prove what it claims. Your silence cannot be used against you, cannot be interpreted as an admission of guilt. You do not have to prove anything. The burden is entirely on those who accuse you. This shifts the entire psychology of criminal justice, the entire balance of power in the courtroom. It respects human dignity by starting from a position of trust rather than suspicion. It recognizes that errors in justice should favor letting the guilty go free rather than punishing the innocent. It makes the state work harder, much harder, to take away someone's freedom. Let us visit a story that illustrates this principle's power, a story from Paris not long after the Napoleonic Code had been established as the law of France. In the year 1816, in the bustling streets of Paris, still recovering from revolution and war and the rise and fall of Napoleon's empire, a man named Jean Calas was accused of theft from his employer, a wealthy merchant who traded in fine fabrics and employed several workers in his household and shop. The merchant's silver had gone missing, valuable pieces, family heirlooms, gone from the locked cabinet where they were kept. And Jean, who worked in the household as a clerk and assistant, was the obvious suspect in the merchant's eyes. Under the old system, under the ancien regime's approach to justice before the revolution swept it away, Jean would have been arrested and tortured until he confessed. His guilt would have been assumed from the moment of accusation, and the only question would be making him admit it, extracting a confession through pain and fear and the breaking of his body and spirit. Many innocent people confessed under torture, chose to confess, preferred quick execution to prolonged agony stretched across days or weeks of systematic brutality. But now, in this new France, under the code that Napoleon had established, the presumption of innocence applied. Jean was arrested, yes, brought before the magistrate, yes, but he was presumed innocent until the prosecution could prove otherwise. The burden of proof lay with the merchant, with those who accused Jean of theft, not with Jean to prove he had not stolen. Jean said nothing in his own defense, exercised his right to remain silent, simply let the prosecution make their case if they could. He did not have to explain his whereabouts at every moment, did not have to account for his actions, did not have to produce witnesses to his good character. The presumption was that he was innocent, and that presumption protected him like armor, like a shield that the prosecution would have to break through with solid evidence. They had no evidence, none that would stand up to scrutiny. No one had seen Jean take the silver. No witness could place him in the room when it disappeared. He had not suddenly become wealthy or tried to sell silver pieces in the markets or pawnshops of Paris. The merchant's accusation was based solely on opportunity, on the fact that Jean had access to the house, on the merchant's belief that a servant must have taken the silver because who else could it have been? But belief is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. Opportunity is not guilt. The court, bound by the code, by the principle of presumption of innocence, acquitted Jean. The burden of proof had not been met. The prosecution had not demonstrated guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Jean walked free. 3 months later, 3 months during which Jean struggled to find new employment because the accusations still clung to him like smoke. The merchant's son confessed to taking the silver. He had stolen it to pay gambling debts, had allowed Jean to be accused to deflect suspicion from himself, had let an innocent man face charges, face potential imprisonment or worse, to protect his own guilty secret, under the old system, under the assumption of guilt that had prevailed before the code. Jean would likely have been executed for a crime he did not commit, would have died protesting his innocence while the real thief walked free, would have become another victim of a justice system that assumed accusation implied guilt, that placed the burden of proof on those least able to bear it, under the Napoleonic Code, under the presumption of innocence. Jean was protected. His innocence was assumed. The state had to prove guilt, and failing to prove it, they had to release him. The system was not perfect. His reputation still suffered. Finding work was still difficult, but he lived. He was free. He was not punished for a crime he did not commit. This principle spread across Europe as Napoleon's armies carried the code to conquered territories and grew. To Italy and Germany and Spain and the Low Countries. It influenced legal reforms even in nations that defeated Napoleon, that rolled back his political conquests but kept the legal innovations he had established. Today, the presumption of innocence is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the European Convention on Human Rights, in the constitutions of most nations on earth, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is recognized as a fundamental principle of justice, as essential to any system that claims to be fair. The psychological impact on modern society is profound, reaches into every corner of how we think about criminal justice. You live in a world where being accused is not the same as being guilty. This seems natural to you, seems like common sense, seems like the only reasonable approach, but it represents a hard-won achievement of civilization. Represents centuries of struggle to establish that power must prove its claims rather than simply asserting them. When you watch a trial, when you hear someone described as an alleged perpetrator or an accused person, when you recognize that conviction requires evidence beyond reasonable doubt, you are experiencing the legacy of the Napoleonic Code. The mental framework that separates accusation from guilt, that recognizes the state must prove its case, that places the burden of proof on the prosecution rather than on the defense. This framework shapes how you think about justice at a deep, almost subconscious level. It also creates a psychological bulwark against mob justice, against the human tendency to assume that where there is smoke, there must be fire. The presumption of innocence requires patience, requires deliberation, requires evidence and proof rather than rushed judgment based on emotion or prejudice. It stands against the human impulse to punish quickly, to assume the accused must have done something wrong, or they would not be accused in the first place. It forces society to slow down, to think carefully, to prove before punishing. In your own life, if you were ever accused of something you did not do, the presumption of innocence would be your shield. Not a perfect shield, not complete protection, because reputation damage occurs regardless of legal outcomes, because the court of public opinion does not always follow the same rules as courts of law, but a legal shield nevertheless. a principle that prevents the state from simply assuming your guilt, from placing on you the impossible burden of proving your innocence. As you settle into sleep now, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to drift, let this comfort you. You are presumed innocent, not by everyone, human nature being what it is, but by the law, by the system that has the power to imprison you, to punish you, to take away your freedom. If the state accuses you, it must prove its case, must present evidence, must convince neutral judges or jurors beyond reasonable doubt. You do not have to prove your innocence. Do not have to demonstrate you are not guilty. The burden rests entirely on those who would take away your freedom. This principle, carved into law 2 centuries ago by a French military genius who became a legal reformer, who understood that lasting power comes not just from military victories, but from establishing just laws. This principle protects you every day, protects all of us, creates a baseline of human dignity in the criminal justice system. Sleep now, peacefully, deeply. Dream without fear of accusation, becoming conviction without proof. The burden of proof rests on those who would take away your freedom, rests on the state, rests on the prosecution, not on you to prove you deserve to keep your liberty. This principle, the presumption of innocence, stands between you and arbitrary punishment, between you and conviction by mere accusation, between you and a world where being accused was enough to destroy you. Rest well. You are innocent until proven guilty. And that simple phrase, those 5 words, represent one of humanity's greatest achievements in the endless struggle to make justice real rather than merely theoretical, to make law protect rather than oppress, to make power accountable to truth rather than merely to itself. And so we pause halfway through our journey. These 5 principles alone have shaped your world in profound ways, but our journey is not complete. 6 more laws await us, 6 more invisible structures that protect you, that govern you, that make modern life possible. The next part of this journey awaits you. Subscribe so you don't miss it. These invisible architectures deserve our attention, our understanding, our awareness as we drift towards sleep. Sleep well. We'll continue this journey soon. Good night.